Turning to 1 Peter. We have in 1 Peter chapter 2 up to 3, something akin to what we call the Greco-Roman household codes, which the author uses to instruct the church to obey the emperor and the governors, instructs the enslaved people to obey their masters, and the wives to obey their husbands, and husbands to live attentively to their wives. The graph above, I have handouts on this, can kindly distribute. You can also pass this Bible. Yeah. Oh, okay. You can just pass that. Yeah. Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the text that has been handed out consists of relationships where the church is instructed to obey the emperor and the governors, or the colonized are being instructed to obey the emperor and the governors, the enslaved people to obey their masters, the wives to obey their husbands, and husbands to live attentively with their wives. The graph that I have handed out will highlight that while efforts to address issues of class and gender have been made in some translation, the imperial presence and ideology is not equally problematized. The examples are drawn from the original African American Heritage Bible that I just discussed and which is circulating, which in the graph I've referred to as AAKJV because it is a King James Version. So AA stands for African American King James Version. The HarperCollins Study Bible, New Revised Standard Version, it uses inclusive language. And then we have the third document, the New Testament and Psalms, an inclusive version, which I've referred in the graph as NTPIV, is the most radical in its effort to be inclusive. Both the HCSB and the NTPI embrace inclusive language translation, while the AKJV is more inclined to address issues of race and class in the text than those of gender. The graph illustrates how they translate those relationships, which I will discuss in a moment. In the human relationships outlined by the author of 1 Peter, we find dyes between the colonized and the colonizer, the enslaved and those who enslave, masters, and the wives and husbands. The text consistently uses verbs hupotasso and timao to describe the duties of the subordinates, namely the colonized church or people, the enslaved, and wives. Save for husbands, the text does not address those in power, like the emperor, those who enslave. Even the husbands, even if the husbands are addressed, they are told to treat their wives with consideration because of the latter's shamed status as weaker vessels. The text, in other words, largely seeks to get the subordinates to remain subordinates without making efforts to contain the exercise of power by the powerful, let alone to problematize inequality itself. In fact, the enslaved are exhorted to be obedient even to the harsh masters. Now the question is, how do the inclusive translations, namely HCSB and NTPI, deal with the relationships of subordination? Notably, the imperial relationships are not problematized, both in names and verbs. Subjects are exhorted to honor the emperor. There is no attempt to name the emperor in any critical fashion, such as those who colonize others. It is notable, as you see in 213, it just goes, for the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether the emperor as supreme or governors. That is the HCB, and the NTP-IV also following the HSAB almost exactly. When we come to the African American King James Version, does not use the term emperor, but employs the king as supreme. Since a supreme king of the land needs not be an emperor, it might be a word choice that subverts imperial power by denying its presence in the text. Turning to class-based relationships of slavery. Slavery might be problematized in terms of nouns, but not in terms of verbs and ideology in the gender-inclusive translations. Thus, the NTP-IV translates "you who are enslaved" instead of slaves. That is chosen by the HCSB. This is found in verses 218 in your graph. The function of NTP-IV translation is both to break the social stereotype that normalize oppressive relationships, as well as to highlight that enslavement is not an inherent quality to any person. Rather, it is something we may do to others. It is a social construction that can be changed. Similarly, using the phrase "those who enslave" rather than the noun "masters" has a potential impact of exposing the evil of slavery as an institution than the rather neutral masters. It thus forces readers, especially those who enslave, to confront the evils of their acts. The gender-inclusive translation NTP-IV, however, maintains that those who are enslaved should accept the authority of those who enslave. Notably, when we turn to the AKJV, that is the African American King James Version, they don't accept the institution of slavery. The translation opts to translate hoi eketai as servants rather than slaves or the enslaved. Regarding the gender relations of wives and husbands, we note several changes in the verbs and some nouns as well. The verb hupotosomenoi comes from the same root word hupatasso, that is obey or submit, that is used in relation to both the emperor and those who enslave. In reference to both the ruler and those who enslaved, the New Testament inclusive version agrees with the HSCSB by rendering the verb as accept the authority. The AAKGV used the phrases submit yourself or be subject, respectively. When it comes to gender relations, however, one observes some notable divergence. While the HCSB exhorts wives to accept the authority of husbands, the NTP-IV translates, wives, be committed to your husbands. This is verse 3:1 in your graph. Instead of accept authority, it says, be committed. I believe commitment and accepting authority or submitting oneself to a husband carry different implications. One who is committed to something has made an independent choice, and possibly because the act of commitment serves one's own interests, or one may believe and even love that which one is committed to. Obedience or accepting authority, on the other hand, does not always involve choice or self-interest, especially in unequal relationships. Obedience tends to highlight powerlessness, while commitment underlines the presence of an active subject with a free will. The NTP-IV translation of wives be committed is thus a subversive act, for it imaginatively seeks to reconstruct male and female relationships away from superior subordinate model. In chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, historical women, including Sarah, are evoked as a model of those who must adorn themselves by accepting the authority or submitting themselves to their husbands. The NTPIV continues to subvert the oppressive ideology by reimagining male and female relationships in terms of women who adorn themselves by committing themselves to their husbands. Instead of Sarah thus obeyed Abraham and called him Lord, the NTPIV reads, thus Sarah listened to Abraham and gave her allegiance. Listening and giving allegiance constructs a wife as an empowered subject and partner who decides to give rather than the one who is obliged to obey. Accordingly, when husbands are addressed in 3:7 to honor, this is in the graph, 3:7, to honor their wives as weaker vessels or weaker sex, the NTPIV translates it into paying honor to the woman in their vulnerabilities. By not giving the adjective weaker, by not using the adjective weaker to characterize women, the NTPVI has neutralized, if not erased, the construction of women as a weaker vessel or weaker sex. The AKJV, the African American King James Version, notably translates the participle in 3:7 as dwell with them instead of show consideration. However, the translation goes on and exhorts husbands to give honor to their wives as weaker vessels. Namely, the gender issue is not problematized. In sum, while the NTPIV makes a greater effort to subvert patriarchal ideology of subordinating women in comparison to the two other versions, it does not show the same thoroughness and creativity in problematizing imperial and class relations. It seems that the imperial and class oppression are more tolerable than gender oppression for translators of NTPIV. The AKGV has made efforts to subvert the institute of slavery and to some extent the empire itself, especially in their introductions, but there is less consistency in deconstructing oppressive gender relations. All the three translations assume heteronormativity in their creative rewriting. Post-colonial feminist approaches, however, call for translation theories and practices that treat the sins of patriarchy and imperialism and their accompanying unequal class, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation with equal seriousness. Towards liberative translation practice. Biblical translation, as dominated by the established institutions of translation, seem to lag behind biblical interpretation scholars. Insofar as Bible translation subscribes to the ideology of faithfulness to the source text or the original audience or original effect, it is largely informed by historical criticism. Biblical translation thus largely operates from a historical critical point of view and largely ignores most of what has been said and discussed about the origins and ideological framework of this approach. Of course, even historical criticism has acknowledged that we do not actually have the original source or autograph in our hands. Historical criticism has long argued that, that most biblical texts had circulated oral for a long time and were later written and rewritten by different authors and editors with different agendas, contexts, and perspectives. These texts, after they were written down, were further corrupted during their transcription and transmission that there is no one manuscript that is completely identical to another. There is no original copy of any book that has been canonized in our Bible. There is no one original audience. The ideology of faithfulness to the source text or source effect therefore really serves some other purpose than preserving the original text. The ideal of seeking for the original and universal meaning in a text has been shown for what it is, namely an imperial ideology of subjugating the other, of insisting that the whole world must read in the same way. As Basnet and Trivedi holds, Europe was regarded as the great original, the starting point, and the colonies were therefore copies or translation of Europe, which were supposed to duplicate. Moreover, being copies, translations were evaluated as less than original. Translation philosophies that swear by the original may be vagabonds of colonial ideology. While feminist biblical interpretation and its insistence on gender justice has made impact on some translation, Bible translators have somehow managed to ignore the implication of Bible scholarship in the past 40 years. Since a translation is inevitably also an interpretation, there is no reason why we have since a translation is inevitably also an interpretation, there is no reason why changes that have informed the scholarship of biblical translation should not also inform translation practices. Biblical scholarship that talks about reader response, social location, post-colonial theories does not seem to have been seriously engaged by Bible translators, not to mention hermeneutics of two-thirds world and minority groups. For example, African biblical scholars have for a long time been drawing from the hybrid identities of African Christianities and talking about enculturation hermeneutics that nurtures an intercourse between African cultural worlds and biblical worlds. Why should this hermeneutical position not inform Bible translation on the ground? Why do translation practice remain divorced from these interpretative and theological trends? These questions are crucial, for they lead one to ask yet another question: for whom are biblical translation done and whose interests are being served? Although contemporary institutions of Bible translation might say that they are responding to the requests of local communities, the structures, operations, and material power of these institutions are always already set for their own advantages and benefits and according to their theories of translation. Closure. As I close, I want to recall the words of Nelson Mandela when he said, "My freedom and yours cannot be separated." I also want to recall and honor my teacher, Marian Tolbert, who taught me the full meaning of Mandela's expression, namely oppression are networks of social categories that do not stand alone. Seeking liberation must be seeking liberation from all other oppressive social categories than just one own's particular pain. My freedom and yours cannot be separated is thus the call to cross many boundaries in the realm of the many different others. It is the call to translate ourselves in multiple ways into multiple imagined communities as we seek justice, not just for our particular places, but for a justice-oriented global community. It is the call to translate against the grain. We may not be women, but we can still be in solidarity with the struggles of women. We may be heterosexual people, yet we can still be in solidarity with gay people. We may not be black, yet we can still be in solidarity with those who are struggling with racism. We may not be colonized subjects, yet we can still be in solidarity with those who are suffering from its historical structures that remain in place. We may not be the earth or trees, yet it should never be too hard to realize that the freedom of the earth cannot be separated from ours. We may not be HIV positive, but we can realize that if we have lost 30 million people within our own lifetime, all of us are living with HIV/AIDS. All of us are HIV positive, that even the body of Christ is HIV positive. My freedom and yours cannot be separated. It is a call for translatory practices and theories that seek to write a new text, a liberated world. Allow me to detour as I close back to the place where we started, when we invited the community of the departed, the dead, to speak to us about translation in the globalization context. Allow me to hear their voices calling us to rewriting the world through translation. And so together with Martin Luther King Jr., I say, I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream. Thank you very much.